The old woman's fingers trembled as she arranged the cardboard boxes against the cold brick wall. Her name was Margaret, though most people on the street simply called her Maggie. At 87 years old, her body ached in ways she had never imagined possible when she was younger. The wrinkles on her face told stories of joy, pain, and survival. Her gray hair, once carefully styled and maintained, now hung in thin strands around her weathered face. She wore layers of clothing, donated pieces that didn't quite match but kept her warm during the freezing nights. Beside her sat little Emma, a 4-year-old girl with bright brown eyes that sparkled despite their difficult circumstances. The child's tiny hands clutched a worn stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. Emma's cheeks were rosy from the cold, and her small body was wrapped in an oversized jacket that Maggie had found at a shelter 2 weeks ago. The little girl never complained, never cried about being hungry or cold. She simply stayed close to her grandmother, finding comfort in the old woman's presence. Their home was a narrow alley between 2 tall buildings in the downtown area. The spot was somewhat sheltered from the wind, and the nearby restaurant sometimes left food in bags by the back door. Maggie had claimed this space 3 months ago, after losing everything. Her small pension had disappeared when the care facility where she lived went bankrupt. Her daughter, Emma's mother, had passed away from illness a year earlier, leaving no one else to care for the child. Social services had tried to take Emma, but Maggie refused to be separated from her only family. So they ran, choosing the uncertainty of the streets over the certainty of separation. Every morning, Maggie would wake before dawn, her old bones protesting against the hard ground. She would check on Emma, making sure the child was warm enough under their shared blankets. Then she would carefully count the few coins they had collected from kind strangers the day before. Sometimes there was enough for a hot meal. Other times, they would share a single piece of bread and some water from the public fountain. Despite everything, Maggie tried to keep life normal for Emma. She would tell the little girl stories, teach her numbers by counting pigeons in the park, and sing old lullabies that her own mother had sung to her decades ago. Emma would listen with wide eyes, completely absorbed in her grandmother's words. The bond between them was unbreakable, forged through shared hardship and unconditional love. In the corner of their makeshift shelter sat an old keyboard, battery-powered and battered. Maggie had found it in a dumpster behind a music store. Half the keys stuck, and some made no sound at all, but it still worked enough to play simple melodies. Before losing everything, Maggie had been a piano teacher. Music had been her life, her passion, her way of expressing emotions that words could never capture. Now, this broken keyboard was her only connection to that former life, a reminder of who she used to be before the world turned upside down. Emma had always been fascinated by the keyboard. From the moment Maggie brought it back to their alley, the little girl would sit beside it, her small fingers hovering over the keys with curiosity and wonder. She would watch her grandmother's weathered hands move across the keys, creating melodies that seemed to fill the cold alley with warmth. The child didn't understand music theory or notes, but she felt something deep inside her chest whenever Maggie played. It was like magic, turning their dark corner of the world into something beautiful, even if just for a few minutes. Maggie noticed Emma's interest immediately. Despite their desperate situation, despite having barely enough food to survive, the old woman decided that music could be Emma's escape. It could be the one thing that gave the child hope, that showed her there was beauty in the world beyond their cardboard walls. So Maggie began teaching her granddaughter, starting with the simplest of songs. She would place Emma's tiny fingers on the correct keys, guiding them gently, praising every small success. The lessons happened whenever they had a quiet moment, usually in the early morning before the city woke up or late at night when the streets grew silent. Maggie would hum a tune, then show Emma which keys to press. The little girl learned quickly, her young mind absorbing information like a sponge. Within weeks, she could play a simple melody all by herself. The first time Emma played a complete song without help, Maggie's eyes filled with tears. In that moment, sitting in a dirty alley with nothing to their names, she felt an overwhelming sense of pride and purpose. Other homeless people in the area would sometimes gather to listen. There was Roberto, a middle-aged man who had lost his job and family, and Sarah, a young woman escaping an abusive relationship. They would sit quietly at the entrance of the alley, listening to the broken keyboard's melodies. The music seemed to comfort everyone, reminding them of better times, of homes they once had, of lives they hoped to reclaim someday. Nobody spoke during these moments. They simply listened, allowing the notes to wash over them like a gentle rain. As winter deepened, the cold became harder to bear. Maggie's arthritis worsened, making it painful to move her fingers. Some mornings, her hands were so stiff she couldn't play at all. But Emma would take over, her small fingers dancing across the keys with increasing confidence. The child had a natural talent that amazed everyone who heard her play. For someone so young, she played with emotion and feeling that seemed impossible. Perhaps it was because she understood suffering in a way most children never would. Perhaps the music was her way of expressing feelings she was too young to put into words. The keyboard became their most precious possession. Maggie guarded it carefully, always making sure it was protected from rain and snow. She would wrap it in plastic bags and old newspapers, treating it like a treasure. Because in many ways, it was. The keyboard represented hope, dignity, and the possibility that their lives could be more than just survival. It proved that even in the darkest circumstances, beauty could still exist. Every note played was an act of defiance against their situation, a statement that they were still human, still worthy, still capable of creating something meaningful. One particularly cold Tuesday morning, a man named David walked past their alley on his way to work. He was a music producer in his mid-40s, always rushing between meetings and recording sessions. His life was filled with deadlines, client demands, and the constant pressure to discover the next big talent. He barely noticed homeless people anymore, having lived in the city long enough to become numb to the sight. But that morning, something made him stop. It was a sound, delicate and pure, floating through the cold air like a whisper. David paused mid-step, his briefcase hanging from his hand. The melody was simple but played with such genuine emotion that it cut through the noise of traffic and busy pedestrians. He turned toward the alley, curiosity pulling him forward. What he saw made him freeze completely. An elderly woman and a tiny child sat beside a battered keyboard, their fingers moving together across the keys. They were playing a duet, their hands working in perfect harmony despite the obvious difference in size and age. The old woman's face showed concentration mixed with joy, while the little girl's eyes sparkled with innocent happiness. He stood there for several minutes, completely captivated. The song they played was an old classical piece, simplified but still recognizable. David had heard professional musicians play the same composition in concert halls, but somehow this version, played on a broken keyboard in a dirty alley by a homeless grandmother and child, moved him more deeply than any polished performance ever had. There was raw authenticity in their playing, an honesty that professional musicians sometimes lost in their pursuit of technical perfection. When the song ended, David found himself applauding softly. Maggie looked up, surprised to see a well-dressed man standing at the entrance to their alley. Emma smiled shyly, hiding partially behind her grandmother. David approached slowly, not wanting to frighten them. He introduced himself, explaining that he worked in music production. Maggie was wary at first, protective of Emma, but something in David's eyes seemed genuine. He wasn't looking at them with pity or disgust like most people did. He was looking at them with respect, as fellow musicians. David asked if he could record them playing. Maggie hesitated, unsure of his intentions. She had learned to be suspicious of strangers, especially those who seemed too friendly. The streets had taught her that kindness often came with hidden prices. But Emma tugged on her sleeve, excited by the attention, and Maggie couldn't resist her granddaughter's enthusiasm. She agreed, but only if they could choose what to play. David nodded, pulling out his phone to record. They played 3 songs that morning. The first was a simple melody that Maggie had composed herself years ago. The second was a children's lullaby that Emma particularly loved. The third was the classical piece they had been practicing for weeks, the one that had first caught David's attention. As they played, a small crowd gathered at the alley entrance. Morning commuters stopped to watch, their hurried lives pausing for just a moment. Some recorded on their phones, others simply stood in silence, experiencing something they couldn't quite name. When the final note faded, there was a brief moment of complete silence before applause erupted. Several people dropped money into an old coffee can that Maggie kept nearby, but more importantly, they had witnessed something genuine in a world that often felt artificial and disconnected. David couldn't stop thinking about Maggie and Emma for the rest of the day. During meetings, his mind wandered back to that alley, to the image of those two playing together with such devotion. He kept replaying the recordings on his phone, listening to the imperfect notes that somehow created perfect emotion. His colleagues noticed his distraction but said nothing. By the time evening arrived, David had made a decision that would change everything. He posted one of the videos on social media with a simple caption explaining what he had witnessed. He wrote about the 87-year-old homeless grandmother teaching her 4-year-old granddaughter to play music on a broken keyboard in an alley. He described how their performance had moved him more than any concert he had attended in years. He didn't expect much response, maybe a few likes from friends who knew he worked in music. What happened next shocked him completely. Within hours, the video started spreading. First dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of people were watching and sharing it. Comments poured in from around the world. People were crying, sharing their own stories of hardship and hope, tagging friends and family members. The video struck something deep in people's hearts, a reminder that beauty could exist anywhere, that human connection mattered more than material wealth. By morning, the video had been viewed over 1 million times, and news organizations were reaching out to David for interviews. Maggie had no idea any of this was happening. She and Emma followed their usual routine, waking early to find breakfast, then spending time in the local library where it was warm and Emma could look at picture books. They didn't own a phone or computer, had no way of accessing the internet or social media. They existed in a bubble, disconnected from the digital world that was currently buzzing with their story. Other homeless people in the area started mentioning that someone was looking for them, but Maggie was cautious, assuming it was social services trying to take Emma away. When David returned to the alley 2 days later, he brought a laptop to show them what had happened. Maggie's weathered face showed confusion as she watched the screen fill with comments and messages from strangers. People were calling them inspiring, saying their music had made them cry, that it had reminded them of what truly mattered in life. Some were offering money, others wanted to help, still others simply wanted to express how moved they were by the performance. Emma didn't fully understand what was happening, but she could sense it was something big from the way the adults were acting. She held onto her stuffed rabbit tightly, pressing close to Maggie's side. The old woman felt overwhelmed, almost frightened by the sudden attention. She had spent months trying to be invisible, to avoid notice, to simply survive day by day. Now strangers around the world were watching her, talking about her, sharing her story. Part of her wanted to retreat deeper into the shadows, to protect Emma from whatever this attention might bring. But another part of her, the part that had once been a proud piano teacher with dreams and dignity, felt a flicker of something she hadn't experienced in years. It felt like hope, fragile and uncertain, but undeniably present. David saw the conflict in her eyes and spoke gently, promising he only wanted to help, that the attention could lead to real change in their lives if they were willing to accept it. The news crews arrived within days, setting up cameras at the entrance of the alley. Reporters spoke in excited tones about the heartwarming story of a grandmother and granddaughter surviving homelessness through music. Maggie felt uncomfortable with all the attention, but David had convinced her to do one interview, explaining that it could lead to help they desperately needed. She agreed reluctantly, but only if Emma could stay out of sight of the cameras as much as possible. She wanted to protect the child from becoming a spectacle. The reporter was a kind woman named Jennifer who approached them with genuine respect rather than the patronizing tone Maggie had feared. She asked about their story, how they ended up on the streets, how Maggie had taught Emma to play. Maggie spoke slowly, choosing her words carefully. She explained about losing everything after the care facility closed, about her daughter's death, about choosing the streets over losing Emma to the system. Her voice cracked with emotion when she talked about teaching Emma music, about wanting to give her granddaughter something beautiful despite their circumstances. When Jennifer asked them to play, Maggie felt nervous in a way she hadn't experienced in years. Playing for themselves or for a few passers-by was one thing, but playing for cameras that would broadcast to thousands felt different. She looked at Emma, who nodded with innocent confidence, and somehow that gave Maggie strength. They sat at the keyboard together, their hands finding their positions naturally. Then they began to play the same duet that had started everything. As the music filled the alley, the bustling city seemed to fade away. Maggie felt transported back to her youth, when she would perform at recitals, when music was her entire world. Emma played with the pure joy that only children possess, completely unaware of how remarkable her talent was for someone so young. The broken keyboard's imperfect sounds created a melody that was somehow more beautiful than any perfectly tuned instrument could produce. It was music filled with survival, with love, with the determination to find beauty in darkness. The news segment aired that evening during prime time. Millions of people watched as the elderly woman and tiny child played their duet in that narrow alley. The camera captured Maggie's weathered hands guiding Emma's small fingers, the concentration on both their faces, the way they looked at each other between notes with such obvious love and trust. There wasn't a dry eye in the newsroom when the segment finished. The anchor's voice wavered as she spoke about the power of music and human resilience. Immediately after the broadcast, phone lines at the television station were flooded with calls. People wanted to donate money, offer housing, provide instruments, help in any way possible. A website was quickly set up to handle the overwhelming response. Within hours, over $50,000 had been donated. Organizations that helped homeless families reached out, offering services and support. Music schools offered free lessons for Emma. A piano manufacturer promised to donate a real piano if they found permanent housing. The response was so massive that it felt surreal, like something from a dream rather than reality. David worked through the night coordinating offers and vetting organizations, wanting to make sure Maggie and Emma would be genuinely helped rather than exploited. He had seen how media attention could sometimes harm the people it claimed to help, creating temporary buzz without lasting support. He was determined that this time would be different, that the attention would translate into real, meaningful change in their lives. The next morning, Maggie woke to find their alley surrounded by people. Some were reporters seeking follow-up stories, others were curious onlookers who wanted to see the famous duo in person. A few were genuinely kind individuals bringing food, blankets, and warm clothes. The sudden invasion of their private space felt overwhelming and frightening. Emma clung to Maggie, confused by all the strangers and noise. The old woman felt her protective instincts surge, pulling Emma close and eyeing everyone with suspicion. David arrived quickly, having anticipated this might happen. He helped create some distance between Maggie and the crowd, speaking firmly to the reporters about respecting their space. He had already been working on solutions, contacting a family services organization that specialized in helping homeless grandparents raising grandchildren. They had offered temporary housing in a supervised apartment while permanent arrangements were made. Maggie listened to the proposal with mixed feelings. Part of her was desperate for shelter and stability, especially for Emma's sake. But another part feared losing control of their situation, worried about bureaucracy and rules that might separate them. David seemed to understand her hesitation. He assured her that this organization was different, that they focused on keeping families together rather than splitting them apart. He offered to visit the facility with them, to make sure it felt safe before they committed to anything. After a long silence, Maggie agreed to at least look at the place. She had survived on the streets by being careful, by not trusting too easily, but she also recognized that winter was getting harsher and Emma deserved better than a cardboard box in an alley. The apartment building was clean and modest, nothing fancy but warm and secure. The staff members treated Maggie with dignity, speaking to her as an equal rather than a charity case. They showed her a small 2-bedroom apartment with a kitchen, bathroom, and even a small living area. It was more space than Maggie had seen in months. Emma's eyes went wide when she saw the actual bed in one of the rooms, bouncing slightly on the mattress with wonder. She had been sleeping on cardboard and concrete for so long that a real bed seemed like a luxury beyond imagination. The caseworker explained the program's requirements. Maggie would receive help navigating social services to secure her pension benefits properly. Emma would be enrolled in a preschool program where she could interact with other children and receive proper meals. They would have access to healthcare, counseling if needed, and help finding permanent housing. There were rules about maintaining the apartment and attending regular check-ins, but nothing that seemed unreasonable. Most importantly, they would be together, as a family, with support rather than separation. Maggie made the decision that afternoon. They would accept the help. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that maybe things could get better. They moved in that same day, bringing their few possessions, including the precious keyboard. As Maggie watched Emma explore their new home with childlike excitement, tears streamed down her weathered face. These weren't tears of sadness or despair, but of relief and gratitude. She had kept her promise to stay with Emma, to protect her, and now they had a real chance at rebuilding their lives. That first night in the apartment, neither of them could sleep. They were too accustomed to the sounds of the street, to sleeping with one eye open, always alert for danger. The silence and safety felt strange, almost uncomfortable. Emma climbed into bed with Maggie, and together they stared at the ceiling, processing everything that had changed in just a few days. Eventually, Maggie began humming softly, the same lullaby she had sung countless times in the alley. Emma's breathing slowly deepened as she fell asleep, finally warm and safe. Maggie stayed awake longer, silently thanking whatever forces had brought David into their lives and given them this second chance. The donated money continued to pour in through the website David had helped establish. Within a week, the amount had reached over $200,000. David worked with a lawyer to set up a proper trust fund, ensuring the money would be protected and used wisely for Maggie and Emma's future. A portion would cover immediate needs like clothing, furniture, and medical care. The rest would be saved for Emma's education and their long-term stability. Maggie felt overwhelmed by the generosity of strangers who had never met them but cared enough to help. Emma's first day at preschool was both exciting and terrifying for Maggie. She had barely been apart from her granddaughter since they ended up on the streets. Watching Emma walk into the classroom holding a teacher's hand felt like losing a piece of herself. But she also saw the wonder in Emma's eyes as she looked at the toys, books, and other children. The teacher assured Maggie that Emma would thrive, that children were resilient and Emma would quickly adjust to having friends and structure. Maggie left the school with tears in her eyes, not from sadness but from the realization that Emma was getting the childhood she deserved. During the days while Emma was at school, Maggie attended appointments. She visited doctors who checked her arthritis and other health issues that had gone untreated for months. She met with social workers who helped her properly file for benefits and navigate the complex system. She even started attending a support group for older adults who had experienced homelessness. Hearing other people's stories made her feel less alone, less ashamed of what had happened to her. She began to understand that losing everything didn't make her a failure or less worthy. Sometimes life simply dealt cruel hands, and survival itself was an achievement. The local music conservatory reached out with an unexpected offer. They wanted to employ Maggie as a piano instructor for their community outreach program, teaching underprivileged children. The director had seen the news coverage and been moved by Maggie's dedication to teaching Emma despite having nothing. They believed her life experience would bring authenticity and compassion to teaching that trained professionals sometimes lacked. Maggie accepted immediately, thrilled to return to the work she had loved before losing everything. Her first day teaching was emotional. Walking into a real music room with proper pianos and eager students felt like coming home after a long exile. The children ranged from 6 to 12 years old, many from difficult backgrounds themselves. Maggie didn't talk down to them or offer false hope. Instead, she shared her own story honestly, explaining how music had sustained her through the darkest period of her life. She taught them that music wasn't about perfection but about expression, about finding beauty even when life felt ugly. The children listened with rapt attention, sensing that this elderly teacher truly understood struggle in ways others didn't. Emma's talent continued to develop rapidly. The preschool teacher mentioned that Emma would sit at the classroom keyboard during free play, picking out melodies she had heard. David arranged for a professional piano teacher to give Emma lessons twice a week, donated by a local music instructor who had been touched by their story. The teacher was amazed by Emma's natural ability and emotional depth. For such a young child, Emma played with unusual maturity, as if the hardship she had experienced had given her access to emotions that most children her age couldn't understand or express. The keyboard that had started everything still held a place of honor in their apartment. Even though they now had access to proper pianos, both Maggie and Emma felt attached to that broken instrument. It represented survival, determination, and the moment when their lives began to change. Some evenings, they would sit together and play their duet on it, remembering the alley and how far they had come, grateful for every imperfect note. 3 months after the video went viral, a television producer contacted David with an interesting proposal. A national morning show wanted to feature Maggie and Emma performing live during a segment about hope and resilience. The appearance would reach millions of viewers and could inspire others facing similar struggles. David discussed the opportunity with Maggie, careful not to pressure her but explaining the potential positive impact. Maggie felt nervous about appearing on television, about sharing their story with such a massive audience, but she also saw it as a chance to give hope to others living on the streets. The producers flew them to New York City for the appearance. For Emma, who had never been on a plane or seen buildings taller than those in their hometown, the experience was magical. She pressed her face against the hotel window, marveling at the city lights below. Maggie watched her granddaughter's excitement with joy, grateful that Emma could have these experiences, that her childhood wasn't entirely defined by those months in the alley. They rehearsed their duet in the hotel room, Maggie's fingers moving across an electric keyboard provided by the show. The morning of the taping, both of them felt nervous. The television studio was enormous and filled with busy people adjusting lights, cameras, and sets. The host, a warm woman named Michelle, spent time with them before the segment, making them feel comfortable. She asked about their favorite songs and assured them they should simply play as they always did, not worrying about being perfect. When the camera started rolling, Michelle introduced their story with genuine emotion, sharing clips from the original video that had captured the nation's heart. Then it was time to perform. Maggie and Emma sat side by side at a beautiful grand piano provided by the studio. The audience fell silent as they began to play. This time, they had chosen a piece Maggie had composed herself, a simple melody that represented their journey from darkness to light. Emma's small fingers moved confidently across the keys while Maggie played the accompanying harmony. The music filled the studio, and cameras captured the concentration on both faces, the love evident in every glance they shared. When the final note faded, there was a moment of profound silence before the studio audience erupted in applause. Many were crying openly, moved by the raw emotion of the performance and the story behind it. Michelle's eyes glistened with tears as she thanked them for sharing their gift. She then surprised them with a reveal that had been kept secret. A furniture company had donated a complete bedroom set for Emma, a piano manufacturer was providing a professional upright piano for their apartment, and a local organization had identified a permanent affordable housing unit where they could live independently. The surprises didn't end there. Several audience members stood to share how Maggie and Emma's story had affected them. One woman explained that she had been on the verge of giving up during her own financial crisis but found inspiration in their resilience. A man shared that he had started volunteering at a homeless shelter after seeing the original video, wanting to help others like Maggie and Emma. A young music student talked about how their performance reminded her why she fell in love with music in the first place, not for fame or money but for the pure joy of creating beauty. After the show, Maggie sat in the dressing room feeling overwhelmed by everything that had happened. Emma had fallen asleep in a chair, exhausted from the excitement and early morning. David sat beside Maggie, and she turned to him with tears streaming down her weathered face. She tried to thank him for everything he had done, for stopping that morning months ago, for caring when most people walked past. David gently squeezed her hand and told her the thanks belonged to her, for never giving up, for teaching Emma that dignity and beauty could exist anywhere, for showing the world what true strength looked like. The permanent housing turned out to be a small 2-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood with good schools. It had a tiny yard where Emma could play and enough space for the donated piano that arrived the following week. Moving day felt surreal to Maggie. She kept expecting someone to tell her it was all a mistake, that she didn't deserve this second chance. But the keys were real, the house was real, and the social worker helping them settle in assured her this was truly their home now. Emma adjusted to their new life with the remarkable adaptability of children. She made friends at school quickly, often coming home with stories about her classmates and drawings she had made in art class. Sometimes Maggie would overhear Emma explaining to her new friends that she used to live outside, describing it matter-of-factly without shame or embarrassment. The other children would listen with wide eyes, unable to fully comprehend what that meant. Emma's teacher mentioned that the little girl showed exceptional kindness toward classmates who seemed lonely or struggled, as if her own experience of hardship had given her unusual empathy for others. Maggie's work at the conservatory became deeply fulfilling. She taught 3 days a week, working with children who came from challenging situations similar to what she and Emma had experienced. She never judged their circumstances or treated their struggles as character flaws. Instead, she focused on showing them that music could be a refuge, a way to process emotions too complex for words. Her students responded to her authenticity, sensing that she truly understood their lives in ways that wealthier, more privileged teachers couldn't. One of her students, a 12-year-old boy named Marcus, particularly stood out. He came from a household dealing with unemployment and food insecurity. He was angry and defensive at first, skeptical that piano lessons would matter when his family couldn't afford basic necessities. But Maggie shared her story with him, explaining that she knew what hunger felt like, what uncertainty and fear meant. Slowly, Marcus opened up. Music became his outlet for processing frustration and pain. Within months, his playing showed remarkable emotion and technical skill. Maggie saw pieces of herself and Emma in Marcus, and she was determined to help him the way others had helped her. The video of their original performance continued to circulate online, periodically resurfacing as people shared it with new audiences. Each time it spread again, Maggie would receive messages from strangers sharing how the video had affected them. Some were homeless themselves and said the video gave them hope. Others were struggling with different challenges but found inspiration in how Maggie and Emma had survived their darkest time. A few shared that the video had prompted them to donate to homeless organizations or volunteer their time. Maggie never imagined their private moment in that alley would create such ripples of impact. David remained a constant presence in their lives, checking in regularly and helping navigate opportunities that continued to arise. A publishing company wanted to write a book about their story. A documentary filmmaker proposed following them for a year to capture their continued journey. Various organizations invited them to speak at fundraisers and events. Maggie was selective about what they accepted, always prioritizing Emma's well-being and their privacy over public attention. She agreed to things that could genuinely help others but declined offers that felt exploitative or overly intrusive. The anniversary of their first night in the alley arrived quietly. Maggie marked the date in her mind but didn't mention it to Emma, not wanting to remind the child unnecessarily of those difficult months. That evening, after Emma was asleep, Maggie sat at their piano and played softly, remembering the fear and desperation she had felt back then, contrasting it with the peace and security she felt now. She thought about all the people who had helped them, the strangers who donated, the organizations that supported them, and David who had cared enough to stop and listen. She played a quiet song of gratitude, letting the notes express feelings too deep for words, thankful for every imperfect blessing that had led them to this moment. As Emma's 5th birthday approached, Maggie wanted to celebrate properly for the first time since losing everything. In the alley, they had marked the 4th birthday with a single cupcake from a kind bakery owner, singing quietly together while sitting on cardboard. This year would be different. Maggie planned a small party with Emma's school friends, decorations, cake, and presents. Watching Emma's excitement while preparing reminded Maggie of what normal childhood should look like, what she had fought so hard to preserve even in their darkest days. The party was a success, with children running through their small house playing games while parents chatted in the kitchen. Several mothers mentioned how kind and mature Emma seemed compared to other 5-year-olds, how she shared naturally and showed concern when other children got hurt or felt left out. Maggie explained a bit about their background, and the parents responded with respect rather than pity. One mother, whose own family had experienced financial hardship years earlier, offered friendship and support. Maggie realized she was building a community, creating the network that everyone needs to truly thrive. Emma's musical abilities continued to amaze everyone who heard her play. Her piano teacher suggested she audition for a prestigious music program for gifted children. Maggie felt hesitant, not wanting to push Emma too hard or turn music into pressure rather than joy. But Emma herself expressed interest after visiting the program, excited by the chance to learn with other children who loved music as much as she did. Maggie agreed to let her audition, reminding Emma that music should always be fun, not something stressful or competitive. The audition day arrived with Emma showing surprising calm for a 5-year-old. She played 3 pieces she had prepared, including the duet she and Maggie had performed together so many times. The panel of judges watched with increasing interest as Emma's small hands moved across the keys with confidence and emotion. When she finished, the head of the program spoke with Maggie privately. He explained that Emma showed exceptional talent, not just technical ability but also emotional depth that was rare in someone so young. He believed that Emma's experiences, while difficult, had given her access to emotional understanding that informed her playing in unique ways. Emma was accepted into the program with a full scholarship. She would attend special classes twice a week, learning music theory, composition, and advanced technique alongside other talented young musicians. Maggie worried briefly about Emma becoming too focused on music, losing normal childhood experiences. But Emma balanced both worlds beautifully, excited about her music classes but equally happy playing regular games with neighborhood friends. The hardship hadn't made her old before her time, it had simply added dimension to her character without stealing her innocence. Meanwhile, Maggie's work at the conservatory expanded. The director asked her to develop a special program specifically for children experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity. She would travel to shelters and community centers, bringing portable keyboards and teaching music to children who needed it most. The program would provide not just lessons but also instruments for children to keep, donated by various organizations. Maggie felt this was her true calling, using her experience and skills to give others what music had given her and Emma during their darkest time. The first session of the mobile music program took place at a family shelter downtown. Maggie walked in carrying a keyboard, memories of her own time homeless flooding back. The children gathered around cautiously, unsure what to expect. Maggie sat down and simply started playing, letting the music speak first. Slowly, the children moved closer, drawn by the melodies. Then Maggie began teaching them simple songs, praising every attempt, making them laugh with silly musical games. By the end of the session, the children were begging her to come back. Their parents watched with tears in their eyes, grateful that someone was offering their children something beautiful amid their struggles. Maggie left that day feeling more fulfilled than she had in years, knowing she had found purpose in her pain. Roberto and Sarah, the homeless friends who used to listen to Maggie and Emma play in the alley, heard about their success through the network of people living on the streets. Roberto had managed to find steady work at a warehouse and was saving for an apartment. Sarah had entered a domestic violence support program and was slowly rebuilding her life. They reached out through a local shelter, asking if they could visit. Maggie welcomed them warmly, never forgetting that they had been kind to her and Emma when they had nothing. The reunion was emotional for everyone. Roberto brought a small gift for Emma, a music box he had saved up to buy. Sarah hugged Maggie tightly, tears streaming down her face as she thanked the older woman for showing her that recovery was possible. They sat together in Maggie's living room, drinking tea and sharing updates about their lives. Roberto talked about his job and his hope to eventually bring his own estranged children back into his life. Sarah described her therapy sessions and how she was learning to trust again after years of abuse. Maggie realized that their story had given hope to people beyond those who watched videos online. For people like Roberto and Sarah who had known them during the worst times, seeing Maggie and Emma succeed proved that escape from homelessness was truly possible. It wasn't just an inspiring story in the abstract, it was real proof from people they had known and shared meals with. Before leaving, both Roberto and Sarah promised to stay in touch, and Maggie gave them her contact information, offering to help however she could with their continued recovery. The documentary filmmaker who had approached Maggie months earlier came back with a revised proposal. Instead of focusing solely on Maggie and Emma's story, the film would document several families experiencing homelessness, showing both struggles and recoveries. Maggie would be featured but so would others, creating a broader picture of homelessness in America. Maggie appreciated this approach, not wanting their story to be seen as exceptional but rather as an example of what support and compassion could accomplish for anyone facing similar circumstances. She agreed to participate, hoping the film might influence public policy and increase funding for homeless services. Emma's school held a talent show where students could showcase various skills. Emma signed up to play piano, choosing to perform the original duet with Maggie. The other children performed magic tricks, sang pop songs, and demonstrated gymnastics. When Emma and Maggie took the stage together, the energy in the room shifted. Parents and students fell silent as the elderly woman and young child played their familiar melody. Many in the audience knew their story, but hearing them perform live brought it to life in a way videos couldn't capture. The raw love between grandmother and granddaughter was visible in every shared glance, every synchronized movement. After their performance, the principal approached Maggie with an idea. The school wanted to start a music program for students whose families couldn't afford private lessons. Would Maggie be interested in teaching there once a week? The position would be paid, adding to her income from the conservatory. Maggie accepted immediately, excited by the chance to reach even more children. She remembered being a young girl herself, falling in love with piano, and how music had shaped her entire life. Now she could pass that gift forward to another generation. One evening, while practicing together, Emma asked Maggie about their time in the alley. She remembered it but in fragments, not fully understanding what they had endured. Maggie had been avoiding the topic, not wanting to traumatize Emma by dwelling on those difficult months. But she realized Emma deserved honest answers. She explained gently about losing their home, about having no money for food or shelter, about being scared and cold. But she also emphasized how they had survived together, how music had kept them strong, and how kind people had helped them when they needed it most. Emma listened seriously, then hugged her grandmother tight, saying she was glad they always had each other. Maggie's eyes filled with tears, grateful that Emma's strongest memory was their bond rather than their suffering. Winter returned, marking a full year since their rescue from the streets. This time, Maggie and Emma watched the snow fall from the warmth of their living room, safe and secure. The contrast with the previous winter, when they had huddled together for warmth in the alley, felt almost dreamlike. Maggie sometimes still woke in the middle of the night, momentarily disoriented, expecting to feel cold concrete beneath her before remembering she was in a real bed. The trauma of homelessness lingered in subtle ways, making her extra cautious with money and protective of their security. A national homeless advocacy organization invited Maggie to speak at their annual conference. They wanted her to share her story with policymakers, social workers, and nonprofit leaders from across the country. Maggie felt nervous about public speaking, doubting her ability to articulate complex ideas to such an educated audience. But David encouraged her, explaining that her lived experience held more value than any academic study. She didn't need to be polished or perfect, she just needed to be honest about what homelessness felt like from the inside. The conference was held in Washington, D.C., another first for both Maggie and Emma. They toured the monuments together, Maggie explaining American history to Emma in simple terms. Standing before the Lincoln Memorial, Maggie felt a strange mixture of emotions. Here she was, a formerly homeless elderly woman, about to speak to influential people about policy and compassion. A year ago, she had been invisible, someone people avoided looking at directly. Now she had a platform and a voice. She felt the weight of responsibility to represent not just herself but all the people still sleeping in alleys and under bridges. Her speech was scheduled for the second day of the conference. Maggie stood behind the podium, looking at hundreds of faces waiting to hear from her. Her hands trembled slightly, but she thought of Emma sitting in the front row with David, and that gave her courage. She spoke without notes, sharing their journey from the care facility closure through the months on the street to their eventual rescue. She described the constant fear, the hunger, the shame of asking for help, the determination to protect Emma no matter what. Her voice remained steady as she explained how music had been their lifeline, giving them purpose and hope when everything else had been stripped away. Then Maggie shifted to what she wanted them to understand. Homelessness wasn't just about lacking shelter, it was about losing dignity, invisibility, the feeling that society had given up on you. She emphasized that homeless people weren't broken or lazy, they were human beings who had experienced catastrophic circumstances. They needed more than temporary beds and meals, they needed comprehensive support that addressed the complex reasons people ended up on streets. They needed affordable housing, healthcare, mental health services, job training, and most importantly, they needed to be treated with respect and humanity. The audience listened in absolute silence. When Maggie finished, there was a long pause before thunderous applause erupted. People stood, many wiping tears from their eyes. Several policymakers approached her afterward, promising to use her story in advocating for increased funding and better programs. A senator asked if she would be willing to testify before a congressional committee examining homelessness legislation. Maggie agreed, realizing that her painful experience could be transformed into something that helped others, that her suffering had not been meaningless. That evening, back in their hotel room, Emma fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the day's excitement. Maggie sat by the window, looking at the lit Capitol building in the distance. She thought about the countless people still living on streets in this wealthy nation, still struggling the way she and Emma had struggled. She made a silent promise to continue speaking out, to use whatever platform she had been given to advocate for change. The viral video had been random luck, but what she did with the opportunity that followed was her choice, and she chose to fight for others who remained voiceless and invisible. The congressional testimony took place 3 months later. Maggie sat at a long table facing committee members, cameras broadcasting her words across the nation. She wore a simple dress that David had helped her pick out, wanting to look respectful but not pretending to be someone she wasn't. Emma stayed home with a neighbor, too young to sit through hours of testimony. Maggie wished her granddaughter was there for support but understood it was better this way. The senators asked questions about her experience, about the barriers she faced when trying to access help, about what policies might have prevented her homelessness or shortened its duration. Maggie answered honestly, explaining how the system often seemed designed to frustrate rather than assist. She described how difficult it was to apply for benefits without an address, to look for work without a phone, to maintain hygiene without access to showers. She talked about the catch-22 situations where you needed identification to get housing but needed housing to get identification. Her testimony was powerful because it was specific and real, not abstract statistics but lived experience. One senator, particularly moved by her story, asked what single change would make the biggest difference for homeless families. Maggie paused, thinking carefully before responding. She explained that no single change was enough, that homelessness resulted from multiple system failures requiring multiple solutions. But if forced to prioritize, she would emphasize keeping families together. Too often, she said, the system separated children from grandparents or other relatives who wanted to care for them, traumatizing everyone involved. Support should focus on helping families stay together while addressing their needs, not fracturing them further. Her testimony was covered extensively by media outlets. Clips circulated online, and many commented on how articulate and thoughtful Maggie was, challenging stereotypes about homeless people. Some criticized her, claiming she was being used politically or that her story was exceptional rather than representative. Maggie expected this response, understanding that her story threatened comfortable narratives people told themselves about homelessness. If an 87-year-old woman and tiny child could end up on the streets despite doing nothing wrong, then anyone could, and that frightened people. The documentary about homelessness, featuring Maggie and several other families, premiered at a film festival and received critical acclaim. Viewers praised its honest portrayal of both the struggles and humanity of homeless individuals. The film showed Maggie teaching music to children at shelters, Emma attending school and thriving, and their daily life rebuilding normalcy. It also featured Roberto talking about his recovery and Sarah working through trauma. The documentary didn't offer easy answers or false hope, but it humanized people society often preferred to ignore. A foundation contacted Maggie about starting a nonprofit organization focused on providing music education to homeless and at-risk children. They offered initial funding and administrative support if Maggie would serve as the founder and director. She felt overwhelmed by the scope of such a project but also deeply excited. Music had literally saved her and Emma, and creating an organization that provided that same lifeline to other children felt like completing a circle. She accepted, beginning the process of establishing what would become Keys to Hope, a nonprofit bringing music education to underserved children across multiple cities. Emma, now 6 years old, continued to excel both academically and musically. Her teachers noted that she showed leadership qualities unusual for her age, often organizing games that included shy classmates or defending children who were teased. The trauma of homelessness seemed to have made her more empathetic rather than damaged her. Maggie watched her granddaughter's development with pride mixed with vigilance, always alert for signs of psychological impact that might emerge later. But Emma seemed remarkably resilient, her foundation of love and security strong enough to support healthy growth despite early hardship. Keys to Hope officially launched 2 years after that first viral video. The organization partnered with homeless shelters and community centers in 5 cities, providing free music lessons, donated instruments, and performance opportunities for children experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity. Maggie hired several music teachers, including Marcus, the student she had taught at the conservatory who had since graduated and pursued music education. The program operated on the principle that every child deserved access to beauty and creative expression regardless of their circumstances. The first recital organized by Keys to Hope took place in a community center gymnasium. 20 children performed, ranging from complete beginners to advanced students like Emma, who served as an inspiration to younger kids. The audience included parents, shelter staff, social workers, and donors who supported the program. Maggie watched from backstage as each child played, remembering her own first recital as a young girl so many decades ago. Some children made mistakes, others played flawlessly, but every performance received enthusiastic applause. These weren't just piano pieces, they were declarations of resilience and hope. Emma, now 7, performed last, playing a duet with Maggie just as they had done in the alley years earlier. The crowd knew their story, many had followed their journey through news coverage and social media. But watching them play together still moved people deeply. Maggie's 89-year-old fingers weren't as nimble as they once were, and Emma's technique had far surpassed her grandmother's abilities. But the love and connection between them transcended technical skill. They played as two souls who had survived darkness together and found light on the other side. After the recital, several parents approached Maggie with tears in their eyes. One mother explained that her daughter had been withdrawn and silent since entering the shelter, but music lessons had helped her begin expressing emotions again. A father shared that his son practiced on the donated keyboard for hours, the only time the boy seemed truly happy despite their difficult living situation. These conversations reminded Maggie why Keys to Hope mattered so much. Music wasn't solving homelessness, but it was giving children something precious while adults worked on solving the bigger problems. David, who had remained involved throughout their journey, helped Keys to Hope secure a major grant from a national foundation interested in arts education. The funding would allow the program to expand to 10 more cities and provide scholarships for exceptional students to attend music camps and advanced programs. David and Maggie had developed a deep friendship over the years, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to helping others. He often joked that stopping to listen to their music that morning was the best decision he had ever made, that they had changed his life as much as he had changed theirs. Maggie's health remained relatively good despite her advancing age, though she moved slower and tired more easily. She delegated more administrative work to staff members, focusing her energy on teaching and program development. Emma worried about her grandmother, noticing when Maggie needed extra rest or struggled with arthritis pain. The roles were subtly shifting, with Emma beginning to care for Maggie in small ways, making sure she took medications and didn't overwork herself. Maggie sometimes felt guilty about this reversal, wanting to remain Emma's protector rather than becoming a burden. But their relationship had always been reciprocal, built on mutual care and support. On Emma's 8th birthday, Maggie organized a celebration at their house with a special surprise. She had contacted a piano manufacturer about commissioning a custom instrument, and they had agreed to donate one as part of their community partnership program. The piano was delivered that morning, a beautiful upright with a plaque reading for Emma, whose music inspires hope. Emma's reaction was pure joy, running her fingers across the keys with reverence and immediately playing a song she had been learning. Maggie watched with tears streaming down her weathered face, remembering the broken keyboard in the alley and marveling at how far they had come, how much had changed since those desperate days when music was their only possession of value. 5 years after that cold morning when David first heard their music, Maggie stood in the same alley where they had lived. Keys to Hope was installing a memorial plaque on the wall, honoring not just her and Emma but all people who experienced homelessness in that city. The plaque featured a simple message about dignity, resilience, and the transformative power of compassion. City officials attended the dedication ceremony, along with dozens of former homeless individuals who had found stability, children from the Keys to Hope program, and community members who had followed their story. Emma, now 9 years old and growing into a remarkable young girl, spoke briefly at the ceremony. She had written her own speech, refusing help from adults who offered to edit it. She talked about remembering the alley not as a place of suffering but as where her grandmother taught her that love and music could exist anywhere. She thanked everyone who had helped them but emphasized that thousands of families were still experiencing homelessness, still needing the same compassion and support they had received. Her words were simple but powerful, spoken with confidence that came from knowing her own worth despite her difficult start. After the ceremony, Maggie stood alone in the alley for a few moments, touching the brick wall where they used to arrange their cardboard shelter. The memories were sharp and painful, but also precious in complicated ways. Those months had tested her in ways she never imagined possible, but they had also revealed her own strength and Emma's resilient spirit. The experience had stripped away everything superficial, leaving only what truly mattered: love, survival, dignity, and the human capacity for hope even in darkness. Keys to Hope had grown beyond Maggie's wildest dreams, now operating in 23 cities and serving over 500 children annually. Several students from the program had gone on to pursue music professionally, including one young man who had won a prestigious piano competition and credited Maggie's teaching for changing his life. The organization had become a model for other nonprofits trying to bring arts education to underserved populations. Maggie had been invited to speak at conferences around the world, though she turned down most invitations, preferring to focus on direct teaching rather than traveling extensively. Emma's musical talent continued to flourish. At 9, she was performing with youth orchestras and had started composing her own pieces. Music schools were already courting her, offering future scholarships and opportunities. But Maggie was careful not to push too hard, not wanting music to become pressure or obligation. She encouraged Emma to maintain balance, to have normal friendships and childhood experiences alongside her musical development. Above all, Maggie wanted Emma to remember that music was a gift and a joy, not a burden or expectation. Roberto had successfully rebuilt his relationship with his children and now worked as a warehouse supervisor. Sarah had returned to school, studying social work with plans to help other domestic violence survivors. Both remained in touch with Maggie, occasionally volunteering with Keys to Hope and sharing their recovery stories to inspire current program participants. Their ongoing friendship reminded Maggie that the homeless community she had briefly been part of was filled with worthy, complicated people deserving of respect and support, not judgment or dismissal. On quiet evenings, Maggie and Emma still played their duet together, the same simple piece they had performed in the alley all those years ago. The notes remained unchanged, but their meaning had deepened over time. What began as an act of survival had become a celebration of survival. What started as a way to teach music had evolved into a symbol of hope recognized by people around the world. The melody was no longer just theirs, it belonged to everyone who had watched their video, heard their story, or been inspired by their resilience. Maggie, now 92 years old, knew her time was limited. Her body was failing slowly, and doctors had warned that her health could decline quickly at her age. But she felt at peace, having lived to see Emma grow into a confident, talented, compassionate young person. She had transformed her pain into purpose through Keys to Hope, helping hundreds of children experience the healing power of music. She had advocated for policy changes that improved services for homeless families. Most importantly, she had kept her promise to Emma's mother to protect and nurture the child no matter what obstacles appeared. One evening, as they sat together at Emma's special piano, Maggie told her granddaughter something she had never quite put into words before. She explained that their time in the alley, as terrible as it was, had taught her what truly mattered in life. Not possessions or status or comfort, but love, dignity, purpose, and the courage to create beauty even when surrounded by darkness. She told Emma that the greatest gift wasn't the house or the piano or the successful organization, it was knowing they had faced the worst together and emerged stronger, that their bond had proven unbreakable even under impossible pressure. Emma hugged her grandmother tightly, understanding in her own way what Maggie was saying. They didn't speak about mortality directly, but both sensed the conversation's deeper meaning. Then, without discussion, they began playing their duet one more time. Their fingers moved across the keys in familiar patterns, creating the melody that had defined their journey. Outside, the city continued its busy rhythm, but inside their home, time seemed to pause. The music filled the room with memories of struggle and triumph, loss and recovery, despair and hope. And in that moment, playing together as they had done in an alley years ago, they were complete. Two souls connected by blood, hardship, music, and unconditional love, proving that the most beautiful harmonies often emerge from the deepest pain, and that grace can be found anywhere if people choose to create it together.